Hello everyone, Bob Lewis around the world. Today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a lesson we did a few days ago where we talked about the Satan's Little Season doctrine. Now, the people who teach the Little Season doctrine like to talk about the Dark Ages of Europe. Now, what they say is that there was a whole historical timeline of history that has been covered up and erased from the history books that took place during the Dark Ages. Now, they say that this hidden history from the Dark Ages was the return of Christ, and that Christ ruled in his kingdom for 1,000 years during the Dark Ages. But what we're going to be learning in this lesson is that the true hidden history of the Dark Ages was not the return of Christ, but actually was the Moorish and Israelite era of Europe. Because the truth of the matter is, the American public school system has failed people and has taught a false version of history that never happened. And this false version of history that is taught by the Caucasians in the American public school system, aka the sons and daughters of Japhet, is a false version of history where their people were always on top and were ruling all of these big empires throughout history. When in reality, empires like ancient Egypt was a Hamitic African empire that has been hijacked by the Caucasians, the sons and daughters of Japhet, and now they depict the ancient Egyptians as looking like them, but in reality, ancient Egypt was a Hamitic, melanated kingdom. Same thing goes for the Moors, who we're going to talk about today, because now the sons and daughters of Japhet depict the Moors as being Caucasoid Arabs with green eyes and black hair, when in reality the Moors were swarthy Negroes. This also has happened to the Israelites and many other groups of people. For example, the Israelites were a Shemitic, Negro, melanated kingdom of people that had a lot of power, especially under Solomon. But the sons and daughters of Japhet have hijacked the Israelite heritage, just like they've hijacked the Egyptian heritage and have depicted the Israelites as looking like them, to create a false version of history of where they have always been on top during this false version of history. But the truth of the matter is that during the Dark Ages, the sons and daughters of Japhet were actually the barbarians, and the blacks were the royalty. Now let's get into it. Okay, our first source is a book called From Babylon to Timbuktu. We're going to get in and read some interesting facts out of this book right away. Okay, we're going to be reading pages 21 and 20, but we're actually going to be starting off on page 21, and then we're going to flip back to 20 and read what page 20 has to say. And Moors. They did not use the term Negro, which is a modern term to refer to the black races, or the word Caucasian to refer to the white races. Dividing the world along a color line was an idea that originated with white supremacists in Europe after the Renaissance. The Europeans did not have any great civilization immediately after the fall of Greece and Rome. Okay, this is key. So this source right here is telling us that the Europeans did not have any great civilization after the fall of Greece and Rome. So during all that time between the fall of Rome and then later on in the 1600s, when the Spaniards and the British Empire really started to fire up, nothing was happening in between those points in history. That's very important to understand. Let's keep reading. During the Middle Ages, the black nations of Africa and Asia had the greatest political, economical, educational, and military influence in the world. At this time, Europe existed in a state of darkness for 1,000 years. In the 16th century and later, Europe began to emerge out of the slough of ignorance. We're going to bring up that ignorance a little bit later. Of ignorance, and certain Germans and others convinced of themselves as belonging to a superior race. Okay, so right here we see that during a key point in history, black people had the best military and had the best educational system. Meanwhile, the Europeans, the sons and daughters of Japhet, were stuck in ignorance in Europe. And we're going to pull out a source about how Japheth, who is the Caucasian, descended into ignorance. We're going to read that. But let's go to page 20. Okay, so this is what I wanted to look at on page 21, how it tells us that the Magogites, the descendants of Magog, were regarded by the ancients as tremendously lacking in intelligence and civilization. So we're starting to see a hole in the ship of the Japhetic white supremacy narrative, because we have old writers saying that these people were not that smart and didn't have a great civilization. But yet we have the people today in the American public school system saying that Shem and Ham were in huts and that they were ruling everything forever. It's not lining up. Okay, we're now going to be tying this up with the Japhetic connection. And we're going to be reading 3 sources right here about the Japhetic barbarian connection. So we're first going to be reading a book called Sex and Race from 1940. That's the shortened version of it. But if we zoom in, here's what this book has to say. As for the supposed sons of Japheth, it wasn't so long ago that the Nordics were called Japhetic stock. They were another people who, according to the Bible, Ham's eldest son, Canaan, was to serve. But when the Phoenicians, the sons of Canaan, were at the height of their glory, the Nordics were sunk in the depths of savagery and cannibalism, and remained so for a full 1,000 years after the glory of Phoenicia had faded. These whites were made slaves by the Phoenicians too. Okay, so we're going to look at that a little bit later, because we're going to dive into the book of Jasher, and we're going to see how the first people in history to ever be defeated and go into slavery was actually the sons and daughters of Japhet. They got beat by Ham. So we're going to see that there's also in the book of Jasher a Japhetic peoples being enslaved and defeated by Ham, just like we just read right here about the Phoenician thing. So now we're going to go down to the Buffalo Christian newspaper from 1850. The once barbarous descendants of Japheth, receiving from the east the gospel and the civilization. So the Japhites, according to this source from 1850, received not only the gospel from the east, but also the civilization. Who came from the east? The Israelites who got scattered into Europe, who also came from the east. The Moors. You see, it's starting to add up now. Now we're going to go to a source from 1887. Japheth descended to ignorance and perversion of intellectual strength. The tribes of the north were barbarous hordes of Vandals. Rome was a robber empire. Greece was corrupt in the splendor of high civilization. Okay, so now we're starting to see it even more. But here we're going to see some more down here. So here's the source from 1849. Also, the civilizing influence of the banished Hebrews on the Japhetic tribes of the Goths, Suevi, Bongards, Alans, Vandals, and Franks, etc. So now we are seeing that there were Hebrews scattered into Europe that had a civilizing influence on the sons and daughters of Japhet. Okay, so the history narrative is starting, the false version of history, the narrative is starting to fade, because we're seeing now that Japheth was a hunter-gatherer during the time that Shem and Ham were fighting for world dominance. So the white supremacist narrative is really starting to crack right about now. Now, before we get into the book of Jasher, one thing that we got to remember is at the end of the Dark Ages is when the enlargement of Japheth really started to happen. It's when Japheth started advancing. He started getting technology. His people started getting smarter, and they started moving all over the world and conquering these different nations and setting up shop there. This is what we covered in the Japheth, True Father of the Caucasoid Peoples lesson, because you have the Spaniards showing up on the scene in the 1600s, and then what they did to Latin America and all those Latinos who are of Spaniard descent. Then you have the Americans in the United States of America who are really descendants of Europeans who came over there. And then you have situations like New Zealand and Australia. So after the Dark Ages, the sons and daughters of Japhet, that prophecy in Genesis 10 that Yah shall enlarge Japheth really started to happen, because they went from being small barbarian tribes to being a huge contender on the world stage today. And because of the false version of history that we've been taught, it's hard to believe that there was a time where Japheth was on top. Because today, this is what people think of when they think of Hamites, which you see on the screen today. And then when we think of the Caucasians, we think of this. But there was a time when this was Ham and Shem, obviously not literally a B-2 spy plane, but you know what I'm saying, was this, and the Japhites were that. Okay, we're now in Jasher chapter 7, and we're going to tie all this together of the Moors defeating the barbarian tribes easily, and the Phoenician thing we just read, And now we're going to be going to the book of Jasher and seeing something very similar in here. This is Jasher chapter 7, and we're going to be starting off in verse 34. And when Nimrod was 40 years old, at that time there was a war between his brethren and the children of Japheth, so that they were in power of their enemies. And Nimrod went forth at that time, and he assembled all of the sons of Cush and their families, about 460 men. And he hired also from some of his friends and acquaintances about 80 men, and he gave them their hire and went with them to battle. And when he was on the road, Nimrod strengthened the hearts of the people that went with him. And he said to them, "Do not fear, neither be alarmed, for all of our enemies will be delivered into our hands, and you may do with them as you please." And all the men that went were about 500, and they fought against their enemies and destroyed them and subdued them. From Nimrod placed standing officers over them in their respective places. Okay, we covered this, which this is very interesting. So it says after Nimrod subdued them, after they beat them, Nimrod placed standing officers over them in their respective places. We know that the home of the Japhites is Europe. So now we have African Hamitic black security guards in Europe watching over these people. Very interesting. So now we have black people in charge, Hamitic people in charge in the land of the Japhites in Europe. Okay, let's keep reading. And he took some of their children as security, and they were all servants to Nimrod and to his brethren. And Nimrod and all of the people with him were turned homeward. And when Nimrod had joyfully returned from battle, he was happy. Most people got PTSD and they're really messed up returning from war. So this must have been some type of a whooping, because Nimrod returned happy. He returned joyfully from battle, having conquered his enemies, and his brethren together with those who knew him before assembled to make him king over them. And they placed the regal crown upon his head. Okay, so this is very interesting. And this is something that is against the mainstream public school American narrative, that there was a time where a Hamitic group of people actually defeated and enslaved a Japhetic group of people. That's something that you're never going to hear in history class. Alrighty, now that wraps up that short lesson. So we now know what was really the true secret about the Dark Ages. It had nothing to do with Christ returning, but it's really a huge whacked out conspiracy and a cover-up from the sons and daughters of Japhet to try and keep the history that exposes the fact that they were not always on top, and that they were enlarged. God shall enlarge Japheth. They weren't always big. They weren't always mighty. Now, one thing I would like to say is that this lesson was not meant to bring down any of the sons and daughters of Japhet, because I know we have many in our congregation here, and that there's many righteous ones all over the world, you know, who Yah loves, and we love you too. But one thing I have to say is that on this channel, we are exposing all lies. We've exposed the wicked lies of the One West camps who lie on the Japhites, you know, calling them Nephilim, Neanderthal, and that, you know, that they're Esau and all that type of stuff. We've exposed all the lies about the Esau's, the white man doctrine, the Neanderthal. We've discovered all that. But now it's time to uncover some of these Gentile lies as well. The Most High Yah loves zero lies. It's not just the One West lies we have to expose. We have to expose all uncleanness, all wickedness, all falsehood. Bye for now.